I'm 16 years old, and I'm standing by a dumpster. I just got done with my first shift at my first job that I've ever had, and I was a busboy at Red Robin. And I'm standing by this big green restaurant dumpster in the back behind the building, and I'm on my phone, and I'm looking at pictures for what I'm going to be spending my money on. And I already know what I'm going to get, but it's fun to look. So I'm looking at, maybe you've heard of them. They're called Red Wing boots. So they're these really nice leather boots, and they're expensive. It took a couple paychecks to get there, but I really wanted these boots, and that's what I was going to spend my money on. And so I worked hard for a couple of weeks, and I bought them, and I got them, and they were perfect. I loved them. They became my signature style. Every fall, air gets a little crisp, the boots would come on, and I would feel good. The years go by, and I moved to New Jersey, come back to New York. And in New York, the fall comes, and I start looking for my Red Wing boots, and I can't find them. I look in my closet, I look in my car, I look all over, and I cannot find these boots. And then it all comes to me in a second. I know what happened. So I come down the stairs from my room, and my dad is sitting at the computer, and I go, "Dad, what'd you do with my boots? I know you moved them." And my dad turns around, and he goes, No, son, I didn't move them. And I go, "You did." I'm like, "You're just old. You forgot where you moved them. You're always moving my stuff. Like, keep away from my things. Don't touch them." And it was like this, I was pretty upset. So I tore apart my dad's closet, looked in his car, looked over, and I still couldn't find these boots. And every year in my family became like this well-known thing, like, whenever we would lose something, like a sock in the dryer, it would be like, maybe they're with Will's boots. So it became like this well-known thing, and every single fall, I would get hyped up about these boots, look everywhere, get upset. And then the summer came one year, and I'm getting ready to go on a camping trip with my friends. So I'm getting all my camping stuff together. I get my camping backpack, I get my sleeping bag, and I'm getting ready to put my sleeping bag into the camping backpack, and I put it in, and it only goes in about halfway. And I'm like, that's weird, so I take it out, and I put my hand in the backpack, and I'm rummaging around. I'm like, what's this? And I pull out, they're my Red Wing boots. They were in my backpack the whole time. And so I put them on, and I'm like trying to sneak out of the house. But they're really loud, so I'm coming down the stairs, and it's like clump, clump, clump. And my dad is sitting at the computer, and he hears the boots come down the stairs, so he turns around, and he looks at me. He looks at my boots, and he looks back at me, and then he just slowly turns back to the computer. It doesn't say anything. Today, when we read in 1 Peter, we're going to hear about unjust accusations and how when we get accused of things unjustly, we need to be like my dad and not fight back, not defend ourselves, but close our mouths and trust in God. So we're in 1 Peter. 1 Peter is a book in the New Testament. We're going to be in chapter 2, verses 18 through chapter 3, verse 7. So 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 through chapter 3, verse 7. So as a quick reminder, Peter is writing this letter to a group of believers that are undergoing persecution. And a lot of the persecution that they were experiencing was social. And we're going to see today that was a relational hardship that came, because when someone became a believer, it could cause conflict and division inside of a house. That when one person in a household trusted in Jesus, it would cause conflict and division in the house. And the problem is the outside world is watching. They're waiting to see in the Greco-Roman society, what are these Christians going to be like? Because they're expecting these Christians to cause division and pain and to cause all this relational damage and destroy the family and in turn destroy the entire society. And so Peter is writing this letter into that context to say, how can you conduct yourself well in this environment? Today, believers, our lives are still going to look different than the people around us. We're still going to encounter hardship and persecution, and a lot of that may be relational, either within our own homes, in our jobs, within our families, and we may still have people say unkind things about us, about our lifestyles, our beliefs, our way of doing things. And we're going to see the big picture. The main idea today is that we need to suffer unjustly for Jesus. That believers, we need to suffer unjustly for Jesus. So we're going to read the passage, and then we're going to go through it together, and we're going to see that Peter is talking to three groups of people that would have made up a household in the Greco-Roman society. The first group of people is slaves, the second is wives, and the third is husbands. These are people that would have made up that household. Also, just want to say up top that I'm going to be spending a little bit more time unpacking cultural context than we typically do, because it's so important to understanding what was going on in the lives of the people back then, so we can understand what Peter and what God is saying to the people back then, so we know what he's saying to us today. So let's read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued, entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, on the cross, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing that you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." So our first part, the first group of people that Peter is addressing is slaves. In verse 18 it says servants, but really it's talking about slaves. And it's worth pushing pause just for a second and acknowledging the fact that nowhere does Peter condone slavery. He never says that it's good. Nowhere in the Bible does God ever say that slavery is good. And in fact, the mere reality that Peter is addressing slaves at all would have been absolutely revolutionary for that time, in a time and place where they weren't even considered to be human. So he's giving them dignity even by acknowledging them and writing to them. And in verse 18 he says this, he says, "Be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust." So Peter is saying that for a slave who becomes a believer in Jesus, there's something that they need to do. Because at that time, slaves had a negative stereotype for being lazy and lying and stealing from their masters. And so when a slave believes in God, trusts in Jesus, what are they supposed to do? Do they fight for their freedom? Do they fight against their masters? Do they run away? Like, what are you supposed to do if you're living in that time and your social situation is that you're a slave? And Peter says to continue to serve your masters. Not just the ones that are good and honorable and treat you well and deserve you to serve them, but also to the unjust ones that don't deserve your respect and your obedience. Now, that's an uncomfortable thing. But Peter is speaking into this real-life situation for a huge group of people at that time and trying to instruct to them what it means to be a believer of Jesus in their own context. Why is Peter saying that to them? Here's the key to understanding this entire passage in these two verses. In verse 19, "For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, because of God, not because of your masters, because of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly." So he's telling the slaves back then that regardless of whether or not they treat you well or treat you poorly, because of who God is, you are responsible for how you act and how you treat them. That your behavior ought not to be dependent upon other people, and if you're doing good, if you're honoring those masters, even when they don't deserve it, do you see that God says it is a gracious thing? Gracious is a word that means that God is going to see you. He's going to give you favor and blessing and kindness in the midst of your suffering. Peter is saying to the slaves that God hasn't forgotten about you, that he sees you, and he sees you working and loving and treating people even if they don't deserve it. He sees what you're doing for him. And there's going to be favor and help and blessing and kindness in that. Your situation may not change, but he's going to be with you in the midst of that. It's a gracious thing. Notice the contrast. In verse 20, he says, "For what credit is it if when you sin and you're beaten for it, you endure? But if you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God." What he's saying is, if you commit a sin and that causes you to suffer, like, whoop-de-doo. Like, that's normal consequence. If I rob a bank and then I go to jail, I'm going to suffer by going to jail, but that's a natural consequence for my actions. But what Peter is saying is if you suffer and you don't deserve it, God says, I see you in the midst of it, and I'm going to give you my help and my favor and my blessing, even in the midst of that unjust suffering. Now, that can be very hard for us to swallow. We don't like that. It's not easy for us to suffer unjustly, is it? That's like one of the first things that toddlers learn. They learn what's fair and what's not fair. And so when we're like, oof, that's not fair. I don't deserve to be treated that way. We can get very defensive and fight back. But here's what God tells us to do in verse 21. "For to this you have been called." Everybody, not just the people back then, we have all been called to suffer when we don't deserve it, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus, God of the universe, became like a slave. Now, unlike a slave who had no power to change their situation, Jesus, had all the power. He didn't have to suffer. He didn't have to go to the cross. He could have changed it in an instant. But he allowed himself to suffer even when he didn't deserve it. And it's a good thing that he did. It's a good thing that Jesus stood in front of the judge and had all those accusations against him that were untrue, and he didn't fight back. He didn't defend himself. He didn't revile. He didn't get angry. He didn't blame. He didn't fight. He closed his mouth and allowed himself to be attacked unjustly. And it's a good thing that he did. Imagine if Jesus had won the argument. It's a very good thing that Jesus allowed himself to suffer, because through his suffering, through his wounds, we all have a chance of life. Because of the suffering of Jesus, we all have an opportunity to have eternal life and forgiveness when we believe in him and the payment that he made on the cross. The cross is one of the most unfair things that has ever happened. Jesus was completely innocent. and he suffered and died a criminal's death, and he allowed it to happen. Partly so he could pay the penalty of all of our debt, but also here Peter says, so that he gives us an example. So the next time at your job, if your boss accuses you of something that you didn't do, follow Jesus, close your mouth, and trust in God. The next time that someone's gossiping about you or slandering you or saying unkind things about you that you know aren't true, follow Jesus, close your mouth, and trust in God. And here's the truth. It may lead you into suffering. Maybe you're in this room and you're thinking like, okay, Will, but if I don't defend myself when people accuse me of things, I might lose my job, I might lose family, I might lose friends. And here's the truth, is that you might. You might. Jesus lost his life. But don't miss that through the unjust suffering of Jesus, God created this amazing plan of redemption and hope in life. A lot of times, God uses our suffering to bring about amazing beauty. Trust in God. Friends, if you make your decisions about who you want to be and how you want to act based upon avoiding suffering, it will be impossible for you to follow Jesus. Be willing to step into suffering. Trust God enough that the next time you're accused and attacked, be like Jesus and close your mouth and trust in God that no matter what happens, he sees you, he hasn't forgotten you, and there's going to be a blessing and help and favor in the midst of it. The second group of people that Peter addresses are wives. Chapter 3, verse 1, he says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of your hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing that you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." So for women, for wives in that society, they were at the very bottom of the social ladder. They were above slaves, and next up on the ladder is women. So women had a problem back then. Wives had a problem. Because in the Greco-Roman society, you followed whatever your husband did. Whatever gods your husband worshipped, those were the gods that you worshipped, and your entire family worshipped. And so if you're a woman back then, if you're a wife to a husband who hasn't believed in Jesus yet, but you've given your life to him, what do? You've got a really big problem. How do you interact with your husband? And notice there are three things that Peter advises wives back then to do. The first thing he says is continue to obey your husband. So Peter's not saying divorce your husband when you trust in Jesus. He's not saying leave him, run away, cause division and pain in your home. He says continue to obey your husband. Don't cause dissension and pain in your home. Continue to obey him. The second thing he says is don't teach your husband. He says, don't teach your husband about Jesus. He says, let your husband be so amazed by the way that you act. You're so honorable and you're so pure, and the way that you treat him and the way that you treat everybody in your family, that he goes, something is different with my wife. Where has she gone? Something is way different now. Let him be the one to ask questions about Jesus, because back then, for a woman to teach a man would have been a huge insult. He wouldn't have been able to hear about Jesus because he would have been so insulted socially. So Peter is saying, let your life be so transformed that he can't help but notice that something is different about you and ask about Jesus. Here's the third thing, is he says, be modest. Be modest. Don't put your hair up, put on makeup, gold, jewelry. And it's a very simple picture, is that what Peter is saying is don't let anybody, your husband or the rest of society, look at you and go, ever since she believed in that other God, that Jesus guy, it looks like she's on the hunt for another husband. She's putting her hair up, she's got her fancy jewels, she's going out, it looks like she's on the prowl. He says, don't do that. Continue to be modest. Continue to respect your husband. God is saying the same thing back then as he is to us today, as he is to wives today. He says, love and respect your husband in culturally appropriate ways. Love and respect your husband in culturally appropriate ways. What God isn't saying is that women have to be on the lowest rung of society. He's not saying they have to obey an abusive husband. Not saying that they can't teach and talk about Jesus at home. Not saying that they can't wear makeup and clothes and jewelry. But he's saying the same thing that he said back then. He says to wives today, love and respect your husband in culturally appropriate ways. Now, ladies, some of you may be thinking, okay, Will, but my husband's he's not that good. He's kind of lazy. He doesn't deserve for me to love and respect him. And here's the picture, is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Look at what he says. He says in verse 6 that Sarah obeyed Abraham. Calling him Lord doesn't mean you have to call your husbands Lord. It means that was the culturally appropriate thing to do back then. And you are the heir of her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Peter is referring to Sarah and Abraham. These are two people in the Old Testament we can read about now. And if you remember them, Abraham, he wasn't always the best husband, was he? In fact, Abraham, he did some pretty awful stuff. And yet, Sarah continued to obey him. She continued to love and respect her husband and continued to follow him, even when it led her into suffering. So ladies, wives, you continue to love and respect and follow your husband, even if it leads you into a place of suffering, because when that happens, God says that he's going to be gracious with you, and there's going to be favor and help in the midst of that suffering. By following a husband and loving and respecting a husband who doesn't deserve it, you're following in the footsteps of Jesus. Now, in our cultural context, loving and respecting your husband might look a little different. Let me ask you this, ladies, how do you talk about your husband when he's not in the room? How do you talk about your husband with your friends or in your workplace? Would the impression that people have after hearing you talk about your husband be, wow, she really loves and respects him? Because in today's society, husbands have a lot of narrow stereotypes about them, that they're lazy, incompetent, stupid, lustful. Is the way that you speak about your husband, does that push him into those categories? Let me ask you this, ladies. If you and your husband get in a disagreement about something, and it turns out that you were right, what do? Do you go, I told you so, I knew it? Do you slander him, shame him, berate him? The call here is to be like Jesus, to close our mouths, and to continue to trust in God. To suffer when you don't deserve it, to God, when you're trying to love and respect your husband, is a gracious thing, and he's going to help you there. Gentlemen, part 3, husbands, verse 7, last people group that Peter talks about is husbands. He says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So husbands, men back then, they weren't like slaves or women where they were on the lower rung of society. But, and we can tell that because he doesn't have the same problems as the women do. Notice it doesn't say whether or not these wives are believing wives or unbelieving wives, because it didn't really matter. Whatever the husband believed, then the whole family would follow after that. Here's what would stand out in society. Does the husband treat his wife like property or like a partner? Because God is saying to husbands, to men back then and to us today, that women are partners. They're heirs to the grace of life. That would have been revolutionary and shocking If a man in Greco-Roman society treated his wife not like a piece of property, but like a partner, that would have been shocking to everybody who saw that. He says, don't use your physical strength to dominate, to abuse, to control women. Instead, honor them because they are heirs to the grace of life with you. Gentlemen, we need to be very careful because there's a flashing red light of warning here. Do you see how important this is? The end of verse 7. If we don't honor and our wives, our prayers will be hindered. That's very scary. God says, don't even talk to me if you're not honoring and loving your wife. He says, I can't hear you because you're not stewarding well the treasure that I gave you. Gentlemen, that should be very scary to us. That's very scary to me because there are times when I'm domineering and neglectful and I don't dwell with my wife in an understanding way. And God says, you got to make it right with her. Don't come and pray to me, hypocrite, when you're not honoring and treasuring your wife. We've got to be very careful. Now, maybe you're here and you're thinking, yeah, but Will, you don't know my wife. She doesn't deserve it. She doesn't respect me. She doesn't take care of me. She doesn't take care of the house, the kids. She's not worthy of me honoring and loving her. Gentlemen, it doesn't matter. We're not doing it for her. Remember, God says, for my sake, this is how you ought to treat your wife. As unto God, regardless of her behavior. And maybe that leads you into a place of suffering where maybe she is neglectful. And maybe it is hard. And maybe you do have to step in and fill in the gap at home. But God says, when you love your wife and you follow me into suffering, I won't forget about you. I see you there. There's going to be grace and favor and help. Regardless of how our wives treat us, gentlemen, we must live with our wives in an understanding way, showing honor to them like partners. It's absolutely critical. To wrap it up, God says, when you suffer unjustly, He's going to give you grace. Wives, even when your husbands don't deserve it, continue to love and respect them. Husbands, even when your wives don't deserve it, continue to love and honor them. Because God is saying to everybody here, married or not, that we all need to suffer unjustly for Jesus because Jesus suffered unjustly for us.